You're curious about the whole Star Wars franchise, but it's so intimidating. Where to begin? Will you enjoy it? There's so much. I'm going to give you a spoiler-free guide so that you can go into it and start your adventure. People posting their first-time reactions to Star Wars. I see a lot of comments explaining some common tidbits about how these movies were made. So I want to help you understand these movies. These will be your notes going into the franchise, so it won't be so intimidating. Trust me, it's easy to understand. It's actually fun. So where do we start? Let's start off with George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars. In the 1950s, he had been enamored by a number of things on television. In the 1930s, there was basically a phenomenon of movies. They weren't feature films. They were movie. I want to say cliffhangers. They were movie serials. In other words, before the main feature or alongside the main feature in the theater, there would be a shorter film. There was Buck Rogers. There was Flash Gordon. There were one or two Batman serials. There were certainly two Superman serials. Now, these were full-length films cut up into chapters or episodes. And so what you would do would be watch that numbered episode that would then end at a cliffhanger. And then maybe the following week, you go back to the theater, you'd watch a different movie, and you'd see this latest chapter in whatever serial you're watching, like, for example, Flash Gordon. At the beginning of Flash Gordon, the Flash Gordon chapter you're watching, there would be scrolling text that would summarize what happened in the previous episode to catch you up. Maybe you didn't watch the previous chapter. So that's why there's that famous text crawl. It wasn't invented by George Lucas. In fact, a number of these things were not invented by George Lucas alone. He was creating Star Wars as a mimicry to resemble or be in the tradition of those earlier movie serials. That's why these episodes would then be numbered, like episode 4, episode 5, episode 6, and so forth. That's why, and I will get into that later, that's why it has that opening crawl in space. And other movies had that same crawl, although it wasn't at an angle. Many times the movie serials will simply show the text on the screen. It would say episode or chapter. Usually it would say chapter, but it would be catching you up on the previous episode, and then, of course, it would end on a cliffhanger. Well, so George Lucas had been fascinated by Flash Gordon. Specifically in Star Wars, it seemed he was copying the Flash Gordon text crawl, and even down to the 4 dots and the ellipses and the type of text. I think the font may have been the same. Anyway, he was also fascinated by racing. He was a race car enthusiast. And there were several other things. He was fascinated by cinema verite, very much a filmmaker. And there's a whole story about how he got into a car accident that changed his direction in life to become a filmmaker. There's plenty of documentary stuff about this. You can explore on your own. All right, so at that time, there were a lot of science fiction stories, whether they be books or films. Dune was a famous book by, I believe, Frank Herbert. And there was the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. I say that because science fiction wasn't created by George Lucas. There were a number of these ideas that made their way into Star Wars. There were allusions, there were inspirations from these other stories that inspired George Lucas to craft his Star Wars universe, so to speak. I also want to tell you another reason why Star Wars is so important. I won't go into details. This is a non-spoiler guide, but it's very clear when you watch it that the Empire is modeled after elements of the Roman Empire and of Nazi Germany. If you watch the uniforms, you will see they were intentionally made to resemble Nazi uniforms. There's a whole regime, the Galactic Empire. I won't go any further, but basically the allegory is that there's this this fascist empire, fascist galactic empire. So there is allegory drawn from human history, human culture, and mythos. Greek myth, I don't know about Greek myth, but the common mythological elements were intentionally put into Star Wars by George Lucas. He was fascinated by there was the hero with 1,000 faces, and I forget the author's name. Joseph Campbell was the author's name, and how carefully he read the books, I'm not sure, but he definitely studied these mythological elements common in a lot of different myths. Okay, we've gone through quite a bit so far. Now I'm going to talk about the history of Star Wars. 1968, he was a production assistant and observer for a 1968 musical called Finian's Rainbow, which was directed by someone you may know of, Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola had mentored George Lucas on the Warner Brothers lot when they were making the movie. Then in 1969, December 1969, he and George Lucas found a company of their own, American Zoetrope Studios. This was intended to be a studio, a film company to make films outside the studio system, because you may know that at that point, it was an interesting point in history. The studio system had been ready for a revolution, and Pauline Kael would soon call these next group of people that I'm going to mention, these next famous filmmakers you probably are familiar with. She called them the movie brats, because they would come onto the scene and shake up the film industry. So, all right, so they create this American Zoetrope Studios. At some point, George Lucas created his, I believe it was a college film project called THX 1138, and then he goes on to make a feature film version of it. The college project, I believe, was black and white, and then the film was in color. 1969, he and Coppola found American Zoetrope Studios. Then in 1971, George Lucas creates Lucasfilm Limited, because, of course, if you're going to have a film company of your own, you've got to name it something. So it's interesting that he and Coppola found American Zoetrope Studios, and then he creates his own company called Lucasfilm Limited. I didn't go into the history of that, but I'm curious. So in that same year, Steven Spielberg's first feature-length film is Duel, which aired on television in the United States, but from what I've heard, around the world, it was a feature. So Francis Ford Coppola organizes a screening of it at his house, and George Lucas attends the screening. He meets Steven Spielberg again. Now, from what I read on an online search, he had met Steven Spielberg earlier, something to do with the university. But here he meets him again at this screening for Spielberg's film Duel. The following year, 1972, George Lucas is assistant editor on The Godfather Part 2 by Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola had suggested hiring Martin Scorsese to direct. Later, Spielberg assists with post-production on Martin Scorsese's 1976 film, Taxi Driver. All right, so we're back in 1973. George Lucas is directing American Graffiti. I believe it would be his first film. It seems like his first film after creating Lucasfilm Limited. It goes very much in line with his fascination for race car driving. The tagline was 1962, or Where Were You in 62 was the tagline, actually. And coincidentally, that seems in some sense like a precursor to the TV show Happy Days, because it had a number of stars who would go on to be in Happy Days, and it had a similar sense of a retro vibe, back to earlier nostalgic times, as Happy Days did. So that was 1973. He directs American Graffiti. It's produced by his friend Francis Ford Coppola, who has been mentoring him. And about this time, he has thoughts on the Vietnam War, which is still raging. This was in its final years, but the United States would eventually, a couple of years later, pull out of Vietnam in 1975. George Lucas and John Milius had a vision for their movie Apocalypse Now, which would be very much like a documentary film. George Lucas was fascinated by the aesthetics of documentary filmmaking. The studios aren't interested in the project. So, meanwhile, he had been thinking about Vietnam and about how empires start off more or less democratic, and then they become expansive and, dare I say it, expansionist. There are all sorts of cultural aspects to it. So, in some sense, the United States becomes more of an empire, going overseas and pushing its weight around the world. So he thinks philosophically about this. In the mid-70s, 1975 or 76, he begins thinking about this idea for something like a Flash Gordon movie. In fact, I don't know where in this it is, but he tries to get the rights to do a Flash Gordon movie. And unfortunately, he fails. He can't get the rights to do a movie. I believe it was Brian De Palma. Someone around him suggested, well, George, if you can't get the rights to a Flash Gordon movie, with the serial based on those Flash Gordon serials, why don't you make your own? Okay, so he begins fashioning together a movie of his own, and it's called, it goes through several drafts, like 3 or 4 drafts, before it becomes something more familiar with what we know as Star Wars. The Adventures of Anakin Starkiller, a whole bunch of different ideas that it's not really worth mentioning at the expense of revealing spoiler information, and so forth. So just keep in mind, he went through several drafts, and they were drastically different. These weren't just minor tweaks. I mean, just in terms of the whole plot. And somewhere along the line, it's clear that he had inspiration from the samurai movies, and possibly Kurosawa, and the movie The Hidden Fortress. In fact, there are some direct parallels with what you see in The Hidden Fortress. He had seen other movies. There are World War II fighter plane movies he had seen. So, as with any filmmaker, any storyteller, he's drawing from these other inspirations around him, trying to fine-tune his, I'll just call it Star Wars movie. So he becomes so engaged in that he gives up on working on Apocalypse Now. And from what I've understood from the documentary, there's a documentary, the Heart of Darkness, about the making of Apocalypse Now, and what a huge undertaking that was. And people joking about how it should be called Apocalypse Not, because people doubted this movie would ever be made. So he basically goes off on his own, and he continues with his Star Wars project, or called the Star Wars project. And so Francis Ford Coppola takes up the Apocalypse Now project. Okay, so now as he's developing Star Wars, he looks around for special effects, which he knows, of course, this being in outer space, this being science fiction, he needs a good special effects crew. You did not have CGI at the time. You did not have computer effects. I mean, okay, you can nitpick. Maybe somebody can create a graphic or something, but that's not to the level of what you would need in a feature film. So 1975, with the studio system, a lot of the special effects teams dismantled, the machinery, the physical machinery dismantled and put away, because I guess there wasn't as much a demand for science fiction, perhaps science fiction films at the time. In 1975, he establishes Light in Magic to make his Star Wars films. And he was recruiting people. I believe, from what I remember, it was in a warehouse that he owned, something like that. It was very, very much his own film. He was the filmmaker behind the whole operation. Meanwhile, he's also trying to get support from a studio. Eventually, Fox, 20th Century Fox, I believe it was Alan Ladd Jr., who says, I don't understand any of this that you're writing about, but hey, I believe in you, I support you. So Alan Ladd Jr. became his supporter within 20th Century Fox. So he goes through a grueling series of months trying to construct this movie. There were compromises. He was putting up a lot of his own money. He was going to banks. This film nearly never was made. Sorry. This film nearly never was made. So, meanwhile, his friend Steven Spielberg comes out with what people have called the first modern blockbuster, which is Jaws. And remember Pauline Kael calling this group, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, as the movie brats that would revolutionize the studio system. Hey, people over here. So he develops it as he's developing Star Wars, as he's coming to the final crunch. You can imagine they're over budget. He doesn't know whether this thing will be made or not. He's talking with his buddy Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg is creating his own film called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And he finishes the movie. And I think George Lucas is basically mild-mannered in general. He doesn't know how big a sensation this would be. He just wanted to make a movie like the Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon movie serials he had seen before, and he had put in this concept of Vietnam, like an allegory of Vietnam, about empires taking control and becoming more like dictatorships. And so he meets with Steven Spielberg. I think Steven Spielberg said in the documentary Spielberg on Spielberg, if I remember correctly, Spielberg mentioned, I'll make a bet with you in terms of points, like movie points. This is somewhat common in Hollywood. Spielberg, I think, gets a point of the profits from this upcoming Star Wars movie, and George Lucas has something other. Whichever movie beats out the other one would be the winner, and then therefore Steven Spielberg or George Lucas would win out. And Spielberg said that with his like 1 point or something from Star Wars profits, he received a huge amount of money. Of course, that doesn't mean that Spielberg wasn't already comfortable with the money he already has, I'm sure, when he was continuing to earn. So George Lucas goes off on, I believe it was a Hawaiian trip. Meanwhile, he had been married to Marsha Lucas. And I should say this, that George Lucas had assembled a movie, and then he had screened it. And here's where Brian De Palma and Marsha Lucas deserve credit. He created basically a first screening of Star Wars, and things were awkward. The structure of the film seemed awkward. So I forget exactly who. It may have been both. Brian De Palma suggested, I think it was Brian De Palma, who suggested putting at the beginning, editing the crawl at the beginning of Star Wars. Initially, it had so much more information, but Brian De Palma suggested editing it down to be more easily followed by a theater audience. And Marsha Lucas, and I know there was somebody else with Marsha Lucas, who came in to edit and rearrange scenes in the film. So the film is finished on its first day of world, on its launch, on its screen launch, whether it was in specific theaters or not. It was probably in specific theaters or a limited release or whatever, as usual. He goes off on a trip, probably to Hawaii, if I remember correctly, and suddenly there's this huge box office bonanza. Like, people start lining up for the movie. This is like nothing they've ever seen before. Of course, around 1968, I think, there was a movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Aside from that, nobody had seen such a combination of special effects. Literally, nobody had seen it. He had created this from the ground up, drawing from creative people, creative artists from wherever he could find them, and building the special effects company from scratch. Nobody had seen a movie that spoke to the optimism, because remember, at this time, this is the 70s. This was just after Vietnam, and people wanted more gritty films, or at least they were seeing more gritty films. They were accustomed to more gritty films in the theater. So this was hopeful. The movie was criticized by some as being naive and sort of stupidly optimistic and simplistic, but it drove people like wild, standing in line, waiting in line, seeing the movie several times, talking to each other about how many times they had seen the movie. So this becomes a big hit. Somewhere along the line during the production, George Lucas had already gone around to various toy companies trying to market this, because, as he's put it, he's seen how poorly film companies have been at marketing their films. So he wanted some kind of direction. Of course, I think internally, I suspect he knew a good thing when he saw one in his Star Wars movie. So none of the companies took his offer. Finally, he went to a company that I believe is in Connecticut, Cincinnati, Ohio. Sorry, I think, called Kenner, and they agree, and they screen the movie, and they decide, okay, which toys will they come out with, and action figures and so forth. There are loads of documentaries just on this aspect alone about the action figures. But there's a reason why I'm mentioning this, for the sake of understanding the characters better, understanding the universe better. So there were T-shirts out when this movie came out. There were toys and so forth. There's also something called the early bird certificate. I won't get into that, but I'll mention that this is such a big deal, and Kenner could not manufacture these action figures in time for Christmas. Their Christmas release, in time for Christmas, basically. So they created a promissory note that kids could get, and that the toys would come later on. So, all right. So, meanwhile, George Lucas has had this huge hit he did not expect. There are plans. Well, I shouldn't say there are plans, but there's an effort that begins to create a sequel. Excuse me. Plans to create a sequel. And as a fallback, in case he can't get a large budget sequel, he creates a story for a low budget sequel called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which would utilize sets and props already created for the Star Wars movie. All right, I should mention that the movie was simply called Star Wars. It had no episode 4 or anything. It was just called Star Wars and had that opening crawl. He also has a holiday special called The Holiday Special, which airs November 17th, 1978. And as he put it, this was a way of just keeping Star Wars in people's minds, because this is before modern hype. Now we're in the era of modern hype where you have the internet and so forth. He didn't want the concept of Star Wars to die off. So that was basically keeping it from flatlining while he created Empire Strikes Back. And so he comes up with Empire Strikes Back. The toys themselves become a huge phenomenon. The Kenner toys, because each action figure had a name, that helped kids understand and learn about references in the 2 films, and eventually 3 films, understand it better, and actually interact. They were reading about magazine articles about the 2 films, and they started learning, absorbing really as much as they could. All right, so now the 3rd movie is released in 1983. I'll jump ahead to 1997. 20 years later, George Lucas wisely figures that in order to release these films, the 2 things had to be done. One, the effects had to be not the effects. The film itself had to be restored. This was, after all, not digital film technology. This was on 70 millimeter or 35 millimeter. This was on actual physical material, actual physical film. So they had to be restored. They had to be literally restored along the lines, little spots and specks flake off and so forth. So that was one aspect. In order to simply be, as he called, a viable piece of entertainment in future decades. So aside from that, there was another concern. There were aspects that he was unhappy about. Remember, he was funding it largely with his own money. There was some studio money in there. He couldn't do as much as he had wanted to do. So there were things he went in and added. This is called, what I'm talking about is called the special editions of the original trilogy, or just the trilogy. He fixed up things. He made changes where people have criticized him for going too far. He altered certain aspects, and when when you hear about people arguing Han shot first, I won't reveal what that means, but you've probably heard mention of Han shot first, and just mention of fans criticizing George Lucas for making changes. That's what I'm talking about. There was a scene left on the cutting room floor in the initial movie where there was a human actor. There was Harrison Ford, who was also in American Graffiti, by the way, Harrison, and in Apocalypse Now. He was walking with a human actor, and they exchanged dialogue. That scene was filmed. For whatever reason, it was left on the cutting room floor. It was not part of the original release. However, the information from that is mentioned in a almost immediately previous scene. So here in the special editions, the human actor that I'm talking about, that's walking with Harrison Ford, has been playing a character that you later see in another film. However, he looks entirely different, not played by a human actor. However, he wanted that scene in there, and I understand the desire to finally put that deleted scene in, because it's one more scene that was filmed, has the human act. It has film from 1976 or whatever it was, whenever it was filmed. I can understand the desire to put that in there. However, he had to use CGI. Meanwhile, perhaps a third reason for doing this was to develop his CGI technology, film technology. In large part, and I don't remember the details, but in large part, he was developing a computer-generated special effects company. I believe it was part of Industrial Light and Magic, but he was on the forefront. If nothing else, George Lucas is on the forefront of filmmaking, revolutionary filmmaking. So he already had, it's primitive by today's standards, and even 20 years ago it was primitive by those standards. He had kind of an early primitive form of that other character superimposed over the human actor in the deleted scenes. All right, in the deleted scene. Okay, so there's criticism over George Lucas over changes he made. That's in 1997. In 1990, I think 1994, he's already working on episode 1 of the original, of the prequel trilogy. All right, so I'll breeze through this. He releases the first movie of the prequel trilogy in 1999. A second episode comes out a few years later, and then a third movie. So now you've got the original trilogy and then the prequel trilogy. And then fans are still having this love-hate relationship with him. Like, we love George Lucas, we love what he created, but we have qualms about what he did with the prequel trilogy. We have qualms about what he did with the special editions, so forth. So he keeps making little tweaks, especially after that initial special edition. Over the years, he would make little tweaks here and there. So there's not just one special edition. There's a 1997 special edition, a 2000 something or other special edition. You get the idea. There are little tweaks. So 2012, he's up there in age, old George Lucas now. So Disney offers to buy Lucasfilm. I should stress that this isn't just Star Wars they bought. They bought Indiana Jones. That's the other huge film franchise under Lucasfilm. And somewhere in here, it would have been, I think it already happened, that this CGI company spins off into Pixar Studios. And there's a whole story behind that. But remember, Pixar Studios can trace its way back to Lucasfilm Industrial Light and Magic. That's how innovative and revolutionary this company has been. And Lucasfilm, Industrial Light and Magic, also did the special effects for other films, revolutionary special effects like Terminator 2, Judgment Day. So, all right, so 2012, Disney buys Lucasfilm, and Kathleen Kennedy is put in charge of Lucasfilm. George Lucas retires. He's going to work on his own stuff, his own films. So Disney has this huge franchise on its hand, not to mention this other huge franchise on its hand, namely Indiana Jones. And Kathleen Kennedy and others put together a sequel series, well, a sequel movie, initial movie for the sequel series. This is getting towards the end of this video. And there were disputes over what they should do. There had been novels. In the meantime, during the dark times of the 1990s, novels set after the original trilogy, but Disney, for whatever reason, Disney decides not to make that canon anymore. George Lucas offers, hey, here's a treatment for where I can see the sequel series going, the sequel trilogy. But they say, thanks, George. Yeah, but we have our own ideas. So you can read more about the sequel trilogy. All right. So now we've established why there was an initial trilogy, why there was a prequel trilogy, and then why there was a sequel trilogy. Alongside, I believe before or just after the release of the first episode of the sequel trilogy was also a movie called Rogue One. I won't get into that, any spoilers about that. I'll simply say that, and I'm leaving out in all of this, I'm leaving out cartoons and sideways TV specials and so forth. So you've got the prequel trilogy, the original trilogy, and the sequel trilogy. You've got two prequel films, sort of standalone films, but they're set in the larger scope of the timeline. All right. Now, that's a good segue to get to the watch order, the preferred watch order. In what order should you watch these films? Should you begin with episode 1 and then go through the prequel trilogies until you get to episode 4 and then watch those and then watch the sequel trilogies? What order should you watch them in? Well, if you're watching them in story order, this depends on what experience you're getting. And in my opinion, no, let me rephrase that. The order in which you watch them dictates the experience that you get. So in a moment, I'll explain why I believe that you should watch them in release order. Begin with the 3 movies of the original trilogy, then go to the prequel trilogy, then to Rogue One, possibly the solo movie, if you want to, and then I'm not mentioning any bias here, but trying to avoid it anyway, and then the sequel trilogy. All right, so if you watch the original trilogy, you will get, I believe, a clearer understanding about the universe. If you watch episode 1, if you watch the prequel trilogy and then the original trilogy and then the sequel trilogy, I believe you would be lost because, this is very important, keep in mind that you may have heard spoilers about certain things, which I won't spoil right here, but it's hard not to know about certain things in Star Wars. Certain things said, certain things about characters, and so forth. So just because you've heard of those things, that doesn't mean that you necessarily know their context, because they're very dramatic. All right. So George Lucas, let me see how I can phrase this. In the first, remember, he had gone through 4 drafts initially before the first Star Wars film, which was simply called Star Wars. And then he released Empire Strikes Back, Episode 5, and then shortly afterwards, he re-released Star Wars, this time saying Episode 4, A New Hope. So there's the history behind that. It was originally just released as Star Wars. So in the first film released, Star Wars, A New Hope, he has a certain background set up. What happened before the film. If you pay attention closely, you will get a sense of what the backstory was based on references and so forth. Ignore what you've heard because George Lucas had not created any of that yet. He was modifying it. He was changing it as the films went into production. He was basically developing this as it went along. So in the second movie, there are some aspects. There's one key aspect that was changed. What's it called? Not retrofit. Retconned from the first film in terms of character backstories. And then in the third film, you can read more about this. I won't spoil it, but there were things set up in the second film that then had to be neatly tied up in the third film released. And that wasn't planned from the beginning. Keep in mind, he had been changing this. The concept of the Force had been developing and shifting and becoming more elaborate. So it's best if you watch the movies in release order because it would make more sense. If you begin with episode 1 in the prequel trilogy, they're practically presuming that you already are familiar with the original trilogy. You'll have so much stuff thrown at you. It could be overwhelming. So that's why I suggest watching the original trilogy. Now, so that does it for whether to watch the original trilogy first or the prequel trilogy first. Now there's something disgusting. If I could go the Harlan Ellison route, there's something disgusting called the Machete order. That means you watch the first 2 movies, and then you watch the prequel trilogy, and then you watch the third movie of the original series, of the original trilogy. That to me is wrong for several reasons. One, it gives away, the prequel trilogy gives away some spoilers that should be surprises in the final movie of the original trilogy. And it may be fine, it may be great. This may be why people are suggesting it. If you've already watched these movies, I can understand it's a flashback. If you watch the first 2 films and then you flash back and watch the prequel trilogy and then you watch the final film of the original trilogy, I can understand the interest in the impact of watching those that way. But number one, it gives away spoilers for the third film in the original trilogy. When I say third film, I mean third film in the trilogy, the original trilogy. Number two, they're not supposed to be broken up like this. If you watch 4, 5, and 6, they act as a nice whole film by themselves. Remember, this is in the tradition of like Flash Gordon movies. The 4th movie is Act 1, the 5th movie is Act 2, and the 6th movie is Act 3. So there's an arc. The main character, and you probably know who the main character is, but the main character experiences these 3 movies from his point of view. So if you're spoiled before going into it by the prequel trilogy, you're suddenly thrown out of his point of view as the main character. The main character is different from the protagonist, and I've talked about Dramatica theory before, but they serve 2 different purposes. The main character is the viewer's own view, one's own experience in the movie. The protagonist is strictly the one pursuing the story goal. That's objective. The main character's role is separate. They can be the same person, however, fulfilling 2 different roles. So if you break it up, you jump out of Luke's. Sorry, I spoiled one thing. All right, sorry. You fall out of Luke's personal perspective in the original trilogy. So I suggest watching, and plus the technology. Let me see. How should I phrase this? The look, the makeup, the scenery looks different if you backtrack to some other period of time and then suddenly go back forward to return to the period of time in which the first two movies you were watching were set. It's a whiplash. So I recommend watching 4, 5, 6. Pay attention. It may take you a second viewing of these films or each of these films. Remember, that's one reason why we went back to the theater so many times. It was to get more and more information. Pay attention to references. They do refer back to earlier time periods. There is a backstory here. Pay attention. Watch those middle 3 films, get some sense overall, and then go back to the prequel trilogy. Watch those films. You may see some discrepancies in there. And that's also why, that aspect of discrepancies, that's also why I advise you not to start with the prequel trilogy or do the Machete order. As I said before, because these movies were evolving over time and George Lucas was shifting and adjusting his concept over the course of these movies being released. So I think that explains it. I don't want this video to go much further. It's already 46 minutes into it. If you are interested in watching these movies, I don't want to seem like stiff. If you enjoy watching, if you want to watch these movies, great. Have at it. Use this as a guide. There are lots of documentaries out there. There's a plethora of documentaries out there and learning material out there. But I understand, for right now, you don't want to expose yourself unintentionally to spoilers or information that could spoil things. So use this as a helpful guide, refer back to it. And again, if you like this channel, please consider subscribing. I do podcasts on 80s toy nostalgia, toy franchises. I have other podcasts. I do a podcast I'm about to create a podcast about the paranormal called Paranormal Blind Spot. Behind the scenes right now, I'm setting up a website for merchandise, t-shirts, mugs, and everything. I have some books in mind to write. You can buy them on Amazon. You'd be able to. I have some stuff on Amazon right now, but you should soon be able to buy more books, more interesting, better written books on Amazon. And there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. I want to make this more of something you would see on Hulu or Netflix or some other streaming service. I'm going to have high quality on or towards the caliber of something on Hulu or Netflix or Prime Video. I don't want to leave that out, Amazon. And disclaimers and something you would see on regular television. So if that interests you, consider liking it. Please leave comments below. I'm always interested in open dialogue and thought, and let me see, and share it with your friends. Consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.